Assalamu alaikum. Peace upon you all. Welcome back to the Science Connections Nature, Curiosity, and Hope. This show is about exploring nature through science to discover the wonderful world around us, from the quarks to the galaxies and everything in between. Our guide will be our innate curiosity, asking critical questions that only lead to more questions, embarking on a journey of trial and error, failing many more times than succeeding in the hope of creating a better life for humanity in harmony with the universe. In each episode, we will meet a scientist, but this time we're going to meet a science journalist, somebody who writes about science and is very, very passionate about it. She will share with us her passion in science and how her journey unfolded, the trials, the errors, the challenges, the triumphs that she faced in her roller coaster journey of discovery. And we will learn, finally, how her work has affected our everyday life. And without her and the scientists around us, life would never be the same. So welcome today to this interview with Pakinam Amer, who is a science journalist and a science communicator and a research fellow at MIT. Welcome, Pakinam.
Thank you, Rana. It's great to be here.
So we would love to know from you, what got you interested in science growing up?
Well, mainly I have to credit my mother for that. So my mom was a biochemist and she was really passionate about science, and she's the one who kind of nurtured that passion for science in me and in my sister, and not just science, but science fiction as well. So she's the one who kind of opened my horizons to getting interested in how the world works, to humans, how we're put together, how the world was created. So whether it was biology or physics or mathematics, she got me curious about that. And that's actually what got me personally into science before switching to science journalism. So Rana knows me, so she knows I majored in physics for a year and a half when I was in college before switching to journalism and writing, which was also one of my passions and one of the skills that I wanted to nurture. And my journey is kind of unconventional. So I started as a generalist. I started, doing things like covering politics and conflict and doing different genres and different beats as a journalist. And I also I did my master's in investigative journalism, which is still like hardcore journalism. And then somehow I wormed my way back to science by coming back to science, but with a different perspective and a different approach. So I'm coming back as an investigator, as a journalist, but also as a researcher who's interested in the intersection of science and technology with society, and with everyday life. And this is the perspective that I take when I write about science. So, like I said, it started in childhood, but I ended up going back full circle to science. And in a way, I consider science to be my roots. I don't know why. Maybe because I did in high school as well. I was, specialized in math and science, and I did physics for a while. But it still feels like it sort of is my roots. That I'm coming back to. And so, yes, about 7 or 8 years ago, I switched to science journalism and I never looked back.
Wow, that's amazing. So, when people talk about science, they assume that the only path to be involved in science is to be a scientist in the lab. But here you are showing us another example of how one can follow and pursue their passion for science by sharing it with the world, taking that role upon yourself. And that's so important because most people don't either understand science or realize how it is involved in their everyday life. And you took that path. So can you tell us more about the challenges that you faced by taking these different decisions, the zigzag path that you took in life, which is in itself a lesson, right? Sometimes we think we know what we want, but then as we grow older or encounter other people or go through different experiences, we realize, oh, wait a minute, I want to change my mind. And it's about following that innate curiosity. So tell us more about the details of that journey of finding your way.
I love that you asked that because I don't believe that either life or career should be a straight line. It's not. and our interests and our passions change. And even if they don't, sometimes the way that we approach them and the way that we look at them change. And perhaps it's good to kind of adapt to that. And that's exactly what I did. It almost feels like it was a smooth journey because there wasn't a lot, I wasn't getting a lot of, dissent from the outside. So for instance, I have very supportive parents when it comes to my career, to the kind of choices that I have. My cats are very supportive. I have a lot of cats. And they never protested, the career changes unless, they have, stuff to eat and a roof over their head. So they're okay with that. So I feel that the environment around me has always been very supportive of me. And I'm also lucky to have, and I have to kind of also emphasize this, is the people that you meet along the way who mentor you or help you or encourage you to take a new path and rediscover yourself in different ways and rediscover your own career. So this is something that I have to put a fine point on. The people that you meet, that you learn from, sometimes it's inadvertent, in the sense that you meet someone and you never knew that this encounter would lead to something else, and on and so forth. And then by serendipity, you end up somewhere and you discover something new. So for instance, recently, so like I said, I switched from, in college, I switched from science to journalism. And then, in journalism itself as a genre and as a career, I switched, I went ahead and explored different beats until I landed in science journalism. But I've also been experimental with the way that I talk and write about science. So for instance, I started as an online and print journalist, and then sort of evolved and moved into experimenting with different multimedia. I've done social videos, I've done podcasts, I hosted and produced the region's first science podcast in English for Nature Middle East, which is the regional edition of Nature magazine, the multidisciplinary journal that is based out of London. And so within my journey itself, there was a lot of left turns and U-turns and right turns, and going back to things that I loved and rediscovering talents. Even right now, I'm kind of rediscovering my passion for art and trying to find a way to kind of sort of merge that with my science journalism and my science communication. But one example of how I pivoted was 4 years ago when I went to MIT to kind of look at VR and look at immersive media and see how I could use that as a tool, as a science journalist, how I could use that to tell better narratives and interesting science stories. And honestly, the way that I got interested in the whole thing was when I was covering a festival in Abu Dhabi. It's Imagine Science Film Festival, which years later I'm collaborating with right now. I'm actually on the board of Imagine Science. But back then, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, this is one of the venues that brings together filmmakers, artists, and scientists to create narratives that are centered around science, that are centered around the environment or pandemics or climate change. And they've produced amazing art. And one of the things that I stumbled upon there was a VR installation that is rooted in science and rooted in environmental science. And it was in that VR installation and that VR experience, you embody an Amazon tree, and you see yourself, growing from a seed into a tree and then experiencing the life cycle of the tree. And it was my first consciousness of testing that type of embodiment, that type of object embodiment through a VR experience. And I was fascinated by the potential of this medium as for science storytelling. And this is what actually took me to MIT. So it was completely by accident. So I think that one of the things that you should do besides being curious is also being open. Sometimes we ground ourselves in our careers or in our passions that they become routine. And we discover, years and years later that, that there was space for experimentation, but because we were so rooted in something, we were so grounded and married to an idea of who we are, it kind of made it difficult to venture out and try new things. And that's what I try to do. I try to keep an open mind about the experiences that I do. And I don't tie it, because I know that when people, I'm 40, I'm turning 41 by the end of the month, and I'm still experimenting with new mediums, and I'm still trying to to find new ways to tell my stories. So I wouldn't tie it with age. I wouldn't also tie it with location. So when I experienced VR, it was in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, and I came back to Egypt, and the VR environment here is not very, it's not very mature, and to even do something in science was way out of the wheelhouse of most VR creators here, and there are very few. And so I had to look for ways to make it happen for myself. And that's what brought me to, I found about the Knight Fellowship, and then that took me to MIT and Harvard, where I experimented with VR. So the journey is never a straight line. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to a very simple, a straightforward question. But yeah.
No, thank you.
Be open-minded, be curious, remain curious. Don't let concepts like age or location or the amount of money that you have or resources that you have kind of hold you back, because there's always a way to find someone to sponsor or fund your idea. There's always there is no, you don't have to follow the conventional way of doing things. So say you're in your 30s and suddenly you discover a passion for science and you want to get into it. You don't have to lament the fact that you didn't major in science back in college. There are still ways of getting to science as an artist, as a storyteller. We're blessed with the amount of, educational institutions and applications that have courses. And, I personally took some courses in basic mathematics when I first started learning coding. Again at MIT, because I had to remind myself. So there are refresher courses out there. There are courses directed at people, who are rediscovering, certain subjects and certain passions. So I would use that. There is YouTube University, it's all free, people sharing their experiences and sharing courses. So you could always, start, and you could always find that passion again.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, the way you're describing your story reminded me of how many traits that you described are the hallmarks of a scientist and a journalist, right? That curiosity, following your curiosity, where that takes you, being persistent and patient, and then never giving up, right? And like, you're never too old. You're never you could just follow that, and that's what gives you that love of life and that zest and that spice that makes you wake up every morning and you don't want to go to sleep because you have all this excitement that you want to follow up on, which to me I think is also what makes us human. That's how we survive as a species, right? It's that curiosity that keeps pushing us. So, and you mentioned the other thing I want to pick up on is storytelling. Again, I think that's also another innate trait in humans, is that we learn through storytelling. Yeah. We absorb all the lessons just through telling a story. And as a journalist, that's what you do. And as a science journalist, it becomes even more fascinating because you're sharing the learnings of science in a storytelling fashion to reach the general public. So can you share with us a little bit another story of something that you encountered in your life that either, where you were very happy, elated, or it got you really, really sad, and how you dealt with it?
Well, first off, I just want to comment on something that you said, because I completely agree that scientists and journalists have very similar methods in the way that they investigate the world around them. And I always, a lot of, in a lot of talks and speeches that I've given, I've talking about the common ground between scientists and journalists, but also artists, because this is something as I started dealing with, technologists and artists in the past few years, working on projects like In Event of Moon Disaster, which won an Emmy, which we'll come back to later. But as I started working with them, I realized that we do have a lot in common. We do have a lot of common ground. And one of them is this sort of method of inquiry and method of experimentation and testing the world. And testing ideas and testing how to communicate certain things. So we actually do follow similar investigation and sleuthing methods, whether as scientists or journalists and artists. And that's why it's easier to kind of work in projects that are multidisciplinary if we find that common ground and if we hone in on it. So I just wanted to comment on that. But your question, your other question is really interesting and really important, because And it's making me think right now, because yes, life is a roller coaster, and it's not always, it's not always sunny and bright and everything is rosy. So I do encounter, in my career, pauses or instances where I feel that I'm disappointed, or that I'm feeling disenchanted with what I'm doing, or with how I'm doing it, and or where I'm doing it, because sometimes you work in places and they're not the best environments to work in. They're toxic environments. You have a toxic boss here. You have things that are holding you back. And I think that in the middle of it, in the moment, it's really hard to kind of see light at the end of the tunnel. And we humans, we have this tendency to kind of blow things out of proportion. So because we're so entrenched in our problems and our personal problems, and we're we're in that moment where things are happening, it's kind of hard to either see a brighter future or remember sometimes that you've passed through similar stumbles before, or you've passed through similar issues before, and you stumbled like that before and got up. And I would say that, I've especially during the past 2 years, I've passed through a lot on the personal level, but also on the professional level, because, there is a lot of, there's a lot of disruption that's happening. And I'm not using disruption like, Silicon Valley uses it in a positive term. I'm talking about it in the negative sense of the word. Pandemics, and people feeling bogged down and feeling depressed and feeling unable to produce, or feeling breathless, trying to kind of cope with everything around them. And I think that the only thing to deal with it is to just keep getting up. Every time you feel bogged down, every time you feel that and there's very few things that you cannot recover from. And this is something that I've learned in my 41 years of existence. There are times when I thought that this is it, this is a point in my career where I'm going to have, where it's going to be stagnant, or this is a point in my career where I cannot grow anymore, or I'm stuck in this job and I don't see, a way out of it, because financially I need to be in this job. And so you feel stuck and you feel caged in. And all these situations, by time, they have resolved by time and some hard work, but sometimes it's just resolves on its own. Like sometimes when you literally have nothing to do, things just, on their own kind of find a way to pass. Sorry, I'm not saying it very eloquently, but it, it's very cliche, but things do pass.
Yeah,
even the worst kinds of situations, they do find a way to resolve. And it's really interesting, because sometimes it's also not planned. But the thing is to also keep your eyes open. So if God or the universe throws you, an opportunity to get out, don't second guess your gut feeling. And I've always followed my gut feeling when it comes to things like this, even when it didn't seem at the moment that was the right, if you logically, put it, and you also need to do that. So you need to plan. You need to have some kind of a plan. I'm not the kind of quit your job and go to Bali kind of person, because, not everyone can afford that, and not everyone wants that. So you have to kind of have some kind of backup plan, but also follow your gut. If your gut tells you to kind of leave a toxic job, that this is it, even if you're not sure exactly, even if you can only plan for like the next couple of months after you leave that job, maybe then it's time to kind of listen to your gut. But also try and have some sort of an idea or a plan to fall back on.
That reminds me of a famous saying that says, "It will always end well." And when somebody said, "But it hasn't, it's not well," the response was, "Well, it hasn't ended."
Yeah.
Be patient.
Very, very true. And it's so hard to kind of remind yourself with that when you're in the middle of a problem. It's kind of, we're always blind to what's happening around us. But literally, like, I remember things from 10 years ago, and I laugh at myself at how dramatic I was, and how I thought that this was the end of the world. And I look back at it now, and it kind of seems very inconsequential in the bigger scheme of things. And sometimes it's actually good to revert to science when you're thinking about that. I mean, think about how big the universe is, and think about, your place in that universe from the perspective, of billions of years of existence. And then you're going to realize how not just small the entire Earth is, but how small your problems are. And to kind of think about it in that existential sense, but of also reminding, sort of grounding yourself, just to remember that this is just, a point that you're like a drop in the ocean. It's a point in time that will, in 5 or 10 years might not mean anything. And in a billion years, it's almost like, dust in the breeze. So it's good to kind of also go back to science and remind ourselves of how vast the universe is and how small our problems are in comparison. But also, I sometimes, especially when it involves something like, physical, because I've dealt with chronic pain for a couple of years, and it was really hard. And I had to kind of, when what we know from medicine has failed to help me deal with that pain, I kind of had to go back to the idea that the body knows how to heal itself. And I kind of had to revert to that idea that, the body is resilient. Everything in science tells us how resilient our bodies are and our existence is, and our will for survival is. There are a lot of things that happen in our bodies that we don't think about consciously, but they happen anyway. They happen like clockwork. And when you immerse yourself in that and you wonder at the beauty of, for instance, how the inner universe of the human body works, it's fascinating. And so it kind of helped me when I was dealing with that chronic pain to remember that my body is a flawless system that can, or almost flawless system that can look out for itself and can power through and can heal it. And I have to have trust in that. And this is what got me through, for instance, the chronic pain, this idea. And I kind of grounded myself in it every time that I felt that I had to remind myself that my body will persevere. Like we persevered as human for millions and millions of years, or not millions of years, 300,000 years. And so I think, as far as we know.
Yeah, thank you. Bringing us back to science in the beautiful way that you did, of how we can draw from it and
get inspired by it and find healing in it too.
Exactly. And then that's how we can live in harmony with nature to live a better life while taking into stride everything that's happening around us. So we're going to take a break to come back and talk about your Emmy.
Awesome. I'd love that.
A free online chat can give you the personalized tips you need to start boosting your retirement savings today.
If I could be you, and you could be me for just 1 hour. If we could find a way to get inside each other's minds. Walk a mile in my shoes. Walk a mile in my shoes. Well, before you abuse, criticize, and accuse, walk a mile in my shoes.
Find out how to use an awkward silence to help a friend with their mental health at seizetheawkward.org.
Right here, baby. Look. Uma.
Something more than a birthday is happening here. Once you can see it, you can help. The sooner you recognize the signs of autism, the sooner you can make a lifetime of difference for your child. Start by answering a few simple questions at screenforautism.org.
Welcome back to Science Connections, Nature, Curiosity, and Hope. Today we have with us the Emmy awarded journalist, Pakinam Amer, who is a science journalist, a science communicator, and a research fellow at MIT. And the show is about, can science win an Emmy? So please, Pakinam, tell us, what is that journey? How did you get an Emmy? And I never thought of science in the context of an Emmy. So please share with us.
So in 2019, I graduated from the Night Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT, where I was working, to explore immersive media and things like virtual reality and mixed reality and AI and immersion to kind of tell science stories. And after I graduated, I joined the MIT Center for Advanced Virtuality as a research fellow. And that's when we started working on the flagship project of the center, the inaugural project, which is a project called In the Event of Moon Disaster. So at that time, I joined a group of journalists, researchers, technologists, and artists at MIT to explore two things: misinformation and disinformation. And for people who don't know the difference, misinformation is false news, and disinformation is false news that is created and propagated with malice and with the intent to warp facts and create confusion. And so we worked on that project together. So it's a group effort. The project was led by Professor Fox Harrell at the MIT Center for Advanced Virtuality, and the interactive documentary itself, which we created, was directed by journalist Fran Panetta and Halsey Bergan, and of course, like a big team of MIT creatives and technologists, and also from outside of MIT, there was a lot of collaborative work. And so what we did is that we created an alternate piece of history by creating and releasing a very realistic deepfake of Richard Nixon, giving an Oval Office speech, informing the public that the Apollo 11 mission, the 1969 Apollo 11 mission, that the moon to the moon had failed. And of course, in case you missed it, Apollo 11 did not fail. That's the real story. Humans landed on the moon. And so we also did that interactive documentary that was a part of it. At the center of it was a deep fake film that we created from scratch, as a team. And we also wrote and curated a wealth of material to inform people on, how we perform that sleight of hand to help them understand deep fakes, which are deep videos created using AI and that make things seem real. And so basically what we did is that we created something using technology, using science to talk about another technology, or the same technology. Basically, we used the same technology that we wanted to create awareness about, to tell people that this technology exists and this is how it might affect your life, and this is how it might affect media and the testimonial aspect of videos. And it was really interesting because the project was rooted in both science and society, and it was the intersection of so many things: journalism, technology, and art. Because at the end of the day, the interactive documentary, the way we looked at it was that it's a work of art to communicate something about science and about society. So the way that it was done, that the speech itself was prepared for Nixon back in 1969 in case the moon landing did suffer a disaster, which it didn't, thankfully. But the speech was never delivered. So what we did is that we created a deep fake showing Richard Nixon delivering that speech that was never given. It kind of, the reaction to the project was really amazing because people engaged with it a lot, but it was also, it was showcased in festivals, and there was a lot of a lot of fascination with the technology, but also created interesting discourse around the place of that technology in our society. And we applied for, we sort of entered it into the 2021 Emmys, and we won. So the core team, so the core team won, and I, like, at the start of the project, I would have never envisioned that this is how far it would go, but it did. And so this is another example of things that, that science doesn't have to be confined to the lab and to research, and, to certain, you don't have to, end up with a Nobel Prize. This is not the first instance of a journalist, of people who are working in science ending up somewhere else. For instance, like I mentioned before, Imagine Science. So Imagine Science brings together filmmakers and artists and scientists and researchers. And I've seen researchers, meddle in art and put out exhibitions that ended up or films that ended up in festivals like South by Southwest or Cannes Film Festival. Actually, there was a VR experience about, the creation, about black holes and, the creation of the world that ended up in Cannes Film Festival. And now, like I said, like the boundaries between disciplines is blurring. And so you could have something that has legs in both art and science, or research and science, or journalism and science. And so don't confine yourself, not just in terms of, of doing the work, but also how you showcase your work. So just because it's a movie about science doesn't mean that you can enter it into, Sundance Film Festival, because Sundance also, started recently in the past few years having, showcasing films and showcasing work that intersects with science in very real ways and in very profound ways.
That's amazing. I mean, you're giving us showing us opportunities, and for anyone who has multiple passions and is trying to figure out what they want, that they can be a scientist and deal with science, and they can be artists and filmmakers and everything in between. And I think in the 21st century, we need those multi-talented people and that's the only way we can solve the problems that we face today, because these problems are multi-discipline, multi-culture, multi-sector. And so we need those people who come and cross the boundaries, because that's where the creativity happens. And you're one example of that. So if you wanted to watch that Emmy Award movie, where do we go?
So moondisaster.org. So moondisaster.org is where you can experience the web version of our interactive documentary, which has the film and has a wealth of resources about deepfakes and how they affect people and how they were created. And I also want to add to what you said is that in this pandemic world, we cannot afford not to care about science, because it affects our lives in very profound ways and in very real and deep ways. The climate crisis as well. This is something else that we cannot afford to look the other way to. So whether you're interested in, politics or gender rights or minorities, whatever your interest is, I guarantee you that it will intersect with science in some way or another, because of public health or because of the climate crisis and the effects of it on marginalized communities, or something like the pandemic and the effect of it on different genders and different races and there are issues of racial injustice there. So science intersects with every aspect in our lives, as it always has. But I think right now it has become more clear than ever how deeply, entrenched and intermingled it is with our daily lives. So I think even if you're a layman, even if you're not interested in creativity and, science communication or creating things, you have to care about science, because it will, and it does affect you. It does affect, the air that you breathe. It does affect, your health. It does affect, and it will affect your future from here on, and the kind of resources that you will have access to or won't.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to highlight two things just to add to what you said. Science gives us data, evidence that we can use to advocate if we want something, or we see an injustice, or we want to change things. the most powerful way to do it is to back it up with evidence and data. And that only comes from applying the scientific method and being rigorous and collecting that data, presenting it. Again, back to you, the journalist. How do you present the data in a way that is understandable, comprehensible to those who are receiving it so that they can make the most of it? And then maybe the other thing about science, as well as the evidence, is to avoid being tricked by people. When you use scientific evidence, you know what's happening. Nobody can trick you. There's no conspiracy theories. You're not ignorant. You can go to the right resources. And because of journalists like you, you can simplify the science so that people can understand. They know how to ask questions. They know the right questions to ask so nobody can take advantage of them. And I think that's another powerful message that we're getting across, and how your work impacts society in general by bringing science to our homes, to our, so that we read about it, learn about it in different forms, like you said, art, movie, film. That's amazing. That's amazing.
And I would really encourage people to kind of follow the scientific method and the way that they deal with the media that we're bombarded with, all the time on social media and from everywhere, to kind of use the scientific method, to use things like contextual clues to kind of try and find out if what they're looking at is real or not. We just talked about deep fakes. There are also other forms of manipulation, like what we call shallow fakes, which is just manipulation of videos, taking something out of context and telling you that this is what's happening now, whether in the public health or in the context of wars. So as a consumer of media, you should be a scientist yourself in the way that you approach, the kind of data that you get. You have to verify it, and you have to look for clues on what could, on who shared this data, to what interests, or to what benefits. And you have to judge the source and their own background and the timing as well of the media that you're dealing with. And these are things that scientists do all the time, analyzing data and analyzing information, and dissecting it and trying to find out, whether or not what they're looking at is really what they think they're looking at. And so as a consumer of media, the more that you read about science and you read about the scientific method and you get closer to people who do science, by watching how they do it and, by reading about them and by reading about their work, I think the more rounded it makes you as a person as well. That's, my feeling about it, because it teaches you skills, like real life skills that you could apply to so many things, whether you're shopping for, clothes, or you're, judging whether, what you just received on WhatsApp is true or fake or misinformation or disinformation.
Thank you. That is amazing, because that's a message we can all take to heart. So what advice would you give this young generation about engaging with science, following your passion, your curiosity as a human being?
I'm a big admirer of the younger generation, what we call Gen Z, because they're very, a lot of them know what they want and they go out and get it. And I would just encourage them to just, keep on keeping on. I love what they're doing, and how savvy they are with media, how they deal, and how they also create boundaries that we millennials are still kind of trying to kind of negotiate. And so I would just encourage them to keep on keeping on and to just expand that curiosity into other areas, and to try not be purists about things, in the sense that, I meet people who say, that they dislike science or do not understand science. But they actually, when you get deeper into them as to why they think that, you discover that maybe they have a bad experience from school that that kind of turned them away from science or from one subject within science. But then when you tell them a story, an interesting story, or you show them something that you've done that uses technology and a science tool, they kind of get fascinated and they tell you, I want to know more, I want to get into that. So they're curious, and they know science and they appreciate it and also understand it. I don't believe that this blanket statement of I don't understand science or I'm not smart enough to be in science. I mean, no one is smart enough to be in anything. You kind of nurture that, and you dive into it, and you try and know more. And I blame, sometimes you have a bad teacher who would not, who would fail to kind of help you understand science, and that impacts you and impacts the way that you look at science. But I would encourage the younger generations to kind of, divorce themselves from these experiences as much as they can, and try and do some exploring on their own, and not confine themselves to these, very false ideas about science. It's not exclusive. It's not for certain people. There's nothing called I'm not smart enough to do anything. You do the work, you put in the hard work. No one is born with smarts or talents. You have to nurture these things. Even art is something that I'm learning, that it's not just about talents. It's a lot of hard work and a lot of discipline and a lot of exploration and curiosity. So as long as you're curious, as long as, you have access to minimal resources like the internet and knowing how to read and write, I guarantee you can understand science, and you can even get into it, and you can start telling stories about science if you want to, if you get passionate about it enough.
Wow, that's amazing advice. And you are a living example of marrying different disciplines together, and that's you're answering the question, science can get an Emmy, because you actually did it. That's amazing.
Not alone. I mean, as part of a big team of
that's another lesson, right?
It's always teamwork.
It's all about teamwork. We can only achieve things when we work together. And many of the challenge, and so your work, it has so many lessons in it. It's about interdisciplinary. It's about creating teams. It's about how to work together, how to collaborate, so that we can really make an impact on the world and raise awareness to what's important, using science as the theme that goes throughout everything that you do. And you're a testimony that if you really like something and you follow your dream and your passion, you can actually achieve, and you discover new goals that you never thought of when you were growing up. So,
and you don't have to leave your job to do that. You could do it in your spare time. You don't have to make drastic changes to your life, especially if you cannot afford to, financially or otherwise. You can just start small and and in your spare time, start exploring on a small scale, and then discover what you want to do or how you want to branch out.
Well, thank you very much, Pakinam. I hope that our listeners will follow up and reach out to you, may ask you for your advice, watch the movie, and embark on their own journeys of exploring how to integrate science in their passions and their journeys going forward, so that they can live better lives and impact humanity in a better way. So thank you very much, everyone, for
Thank
watching.
You, Rana, for having me.
You're welcome. And please, our listeners, stay tuned for the next episode of Science Connections, when we will interview another scientist who has had an impact on our lives, so that we can learn of her or his story and be inspired. Take care, everyone.